Have you ever noticed how thinking about money as you approach your 30s creates a strange feeling in your chest? Like there's an invisible clock counting time and you don't really know if you're behind, ahead, or completely lost. Because no one ever clearly explained what should actually be figured out by that age. They just threw out loose phrases like, by 30, you should be stable. By 30, life takes off. By 30, you've built everything. But no one ever sat next to you to explain what that really means in the practice of a normal life. With a tight paycheck, bills piling up, accumulated exhaustion, and that constant feeling that you work, but don't feel any real progress. Maybe what hurts most isn't even the money itself, but the silent comparison, the one that happens when you open your phone and see someone your age traveling, buying things, talking about investments, while you're calculating whether you can swipe your card one more time or if you'll have to wait for the next paycheck. And then the automatic thought comes that you did something wrong, that you wasted time, that you should be somewhere else, even without knowing exactly where that somewhere else would be. And that's where a lot of people get it wrong, because they start turning 30 into a finish line, when in reality, 30 isn't about having won the game of life. It's about no longer being completely in the dark. It's about having resolved some basic things that lift the constant mental weight and allow you to think more clearly, sleep better, and stop living in this mode of financial survival. The problem is that no one talks about these milestones in an honest, simple, and realistic way. So people think the financial milestones by 30 are having a new car, owning an apartment, high-yield investments, and a fully figured out life, when in practice, the most important milestones don't show up on Instagram. But they determine whether your financial life will keep getting heavier or finally start making sense. The first big shock many people experience is realizing that reaching 30 without financial clarity is more exhausting than reaching it without money. Because lack of clarity generates anxiety every single day, makes you spend poorly, decide on impulse, accept any work condition out of fear, and live with the feeling that everything could collapse at any moment. And before talking about any amount, number, or goal, one thing needs to be clear. The financial milestones before 30 are not a list of external achievements. They are internal points of organization that completely change how you relate to money, work, and the future. The first essential milestone, and perhaps the most underestimated of all, is stopping lying to yourself about your own financial situation. Because many people get close to 30 without knowing exactly how much they earn, how much they spend, and why nothing is ever left over. Living in a silent agreement with themselves of, I'll deal with it later, it's not that bad. Everyone lives like this, when in reality, this lack of confrontation is what keeps the cycle of constant struggle going. This milestone has nothing to do with a pretty spreadsheet or a fancy app. It has to do with sitting down, looking at the real numbers, feeling the discomfort, and accepting reality as it is without sugarcoating it. Because only after that does money stop being an invisible monster and become a concrete problem that can be solved step by step. And here's something curious happens that almost no one talks about. The earlier you face your financial reality, the less emotional weight it has. Because fear comes much more from imagination than from the numbers themselves. And many people discover that the situation is bad, but not impossible. It was just neglected. The second essential milestone before 30 is being able to end the month without relying on credit to survive. And this sounds simple, but it's a massive turning point, because using a credit card, overdraft, or installment plans to live is not a strategy. It's a cry for help disguised as normality. As long as you need credit to pay for groceries, basic bills, and small emergencies, your brain never relaxes. You're always owing a piece of the future just to keep the present running. And that creates constant anxiety that prevents you from planning anything beyond the next paycheck. Breaking even at the end of the month with nothing left over is already a huge step forward for someone who always ends up in the red, because it means you've stopped digging the hole deeper. And only those who have lived for years using credit just to breathe know the mental relief this brings, even if it doesn't look like a big win from the outside. Many people feel like failures for not being able to save money at 25, 27, or 29, but they ignore the fact that they're still fighting to reach this basic milestone, which is simply not making their situation worse every month. Skipping this step creates constant frustration, because you're trying to build something on ground that's still collapsing. The third milestone, which starts to separate those who live in chaos from those who begin to gain control, is knowing exactly how much your life costs. Not how much you think it costs. not how much it should cost, but how much it really costs to live the way you live today with your habits, your quirks, your small wastes, and your emotional spending. When you don't know the cost of your life, any income feels insufficient. Any raise disappears. Any extra money slips through your fingers, and you're left with the feeling that you never earn enough. When in reality, the problem isn't just how much comes in, but how it goes out. This milestone brings something powerful. The ability to make conscious decisions, to say no to certain things without guilt, to say yes to others without fear, and to stop living on financial autopilot, because everything stops being a shock and starts being a choice. And up to this point, if you stop to think about it, none of this involves earning more money, investing, or getting rich. It only involves leaving emotional survival mode, which is where many people spend their entire youth without realizing it. Now, the fourth essential milestone before 30 is being able to build your first reserve, even if it's small. And here there's a huge psychological trap, because many people think saving a little is pointless, that it only makes sense when there's a lot left over. And because of that, they never start, or they start and give up quickly. But this first reserve doesn't exist to cover major tragedies. It exists to change your behavior, to remove the panic from small things, to prevent any unexpected expense from turning into a financial and emotional snowball. When you know you have some money set aside, even a modest amount, your brain starts working differently. You stop making desperate decisions, you handle problems better, and you stop living with that feeling that anything could ruin everything. This is a silent milestone. No Juan sees it. No one applauds it. But it completely changes how you live day to day, because money stops being just a countdown to zero and becomes a tool for mental protection. And many people reach 30 without this milestone and don't understand why they feel so tired, so tense, so irritated about money, thinking the problem is lack of discipline, when in reality it's lack of margin. The fifth essential milestone begins to truly shape the future, which is stopping treating income as something fixed and immutable, even if today it's limited. Because as long as you believe your income is a destiny and not a variable, you adapt to the struggle instead of looking for a way out. This doesn't mean starting a business, becoming an investor, or performing miracles. It simply means starting to see real ways to increase what comes in over time, whether by improving your position at work, developing skills, changing fields, or creating simple and realistic alternatives. Without this vision, financial life becomes stagnant, and 30 arrives with the feeling that the future is already written, which generates deep discouragement, almost a silent resignation. Up to this point, these milestones build something far more important than money. They build predictability, and predictability is what lifts the constant weight from your mind, what allows you to plan, dream, and make better choices. But there's a very common mistake that happens exactly at this stage, and that's what the next part needs to talk about. Because many people even understand these milestones, but sabotage themselves by trying to skip steps, comparing themselves to unrealistic standards, and carrying guilt that shouldn't exist. There's a silent mistake that happens when someone starts hearing about financial organization, milestones, reserves, control, and clarity, which is the emotional rush to try to fix years of mess in just a few months, as if there were a moral debt to lost time. And this rush doesn't come from healthy ambition. It comes from guilt, comparison, and fear of being behind. It's at this moment that many people sabotage themselves without realizing it. They start skipping internal steps. They try to save money without closing the month. They try to invest without a reserve. They try to change their life without minimum stability. And when they fail, they conclude they weren't born to deal with money, when in reality they just tried to run while the ground was still slippery. This mistake is dangerous because it creates a constant feeling of incompetence, even when the person is moving forward, just slowly at the real pace of their own life. And that leads to giving up, because no one can handle feeling wrong all the time. The truth that almost no one has the courage to say is that most people who seem well put together at 30 didn't get there through financial genius, but because they handled the basics early, without glamour, without rushing, and without trying to prove anything to anyone. And here comes an emotional milestone that is just as important as any financial one: stopping using other people's lives as a ruler to measure your own. Because every comparison you make without context drains mental energy, generates frustration, and pushes you toward bad decisions, like spending to look better, taking excessive risks to speed things up, or blaming yourself for not keeping up with a pace that was never yours. When you live comparing yourself, money stops being a tool and becomes a thermometer of personal worth. And that is devastating, because any fluctuation turns into an attack on yourself. This milestone, before 30, is not learning to earn more. It's learning to respect your own financial process, understanding that delays exist, that not everyone starts from the same place, and that moving forward, even slowly, is infinitely better than living paralyzed by the fear of not being enough. Another critical point that needs to be resolved before 30, but that almost no one talks about directly, is the emotional relationship with small expenses. Those expenses that seem harmless, but carry much more emotion than necessity. These are the expenses that relieve exhaustion, frustration, the sense of injustice, the thought of, I deserve this, and there's nothing wrong with wanting comfort. The problem is when these expenses become emotional anesthesia, because then they never fix what caused the discomfort. They just postpone it. Many people reach 30 without realizing that they don't spend because they want things, but because they're exhausted, mentally drained, feeling trapped in a routine that doesn't reward them, and money becomes the most accessible release valve. As long as this isn't understood, no financial organization lasts. Because you cut today and explode tomorrow. You save 1 month and punish yourself the next, creating a cycle of control and guilt that only increases exhaustion. An essential milestone here is learning to differentiate spending that builds real comfort from spending that just masks dissatisfaction. And this isn't learned in a spreadsheet. It's learned by observing your own patterns, without judgment, without radical promises, and without When you start doing this, something changes inside. Money stops being an enemy that prevents you from living and becomes a resource that needs to be used consciously, including for your own well-being. Another fundamental milestone before 30 is stopping confusing stability with stagnation, because many people reject any attempt at financial organization thinking it will kill freedom, make life boring, or trap them in rigid limits. But the truth is the opposite. The more chaotic your financial life is, the less freedom you have, because everything depends on last-minute money. Everything becomes urgent, and every decision turns into a huge risk. Stability is not a prison. It's a foundation. It's what allows you to say no, change direction, breathe before deciding, and without it, life becomes a sequence of reactions, never choices. And perhaps one of the most neglected milestones before 30 is understanding that money doesn't solve life. But poorly handled lack of money complicates absolutely everything, from relationships to mental health, career choices, and so when you ignore money, it dominates your mind. When you organize it, it shrinks, takes up less space, and leaves energy for other areas of life. This understanding completely changes the relationship with goals, because the focus stops being getting there and becomes not suffering so much here, which is much more honest and sustainable. And then we reach a delicate point, because many people carry deep guilt for not having learned this earlier, for thinking they wasted their youth, for feeling like they're now playing catch up, and this guilt paralyzes more than it helps. The milestone here is not compensating for the past. It's interrupting the pattern, because the past doesn't change, but the pattern does. And changing the pattern changes the entire future, even if it's late. At 30, the greatest asset you can have is not wealth. It's clarity, because with clarity, you adjust course, correct mistakes, and avoid bad decisions that cost years. Without clarity, even earning more, everything falls apart again. Because the problem was never just money. It was always internal chaos reflected in the numbers. These milestones don't appear on ready-made lists, but when they start falling into place, the feeling is that something is finally under control, even if it's not perfect. And that's exactly when a question arises that almost no one asks. But that changes everything. What do I need to resolve now so I don't carry this weight for the next 10 years? This question is uncomfortable because it removes excuses, but it's also liberating because it puts the focus on the next possible step, not on a distant ideal. In the next part, the narrative goes exactly into this: how to turn these milestones into practical daily decisions without radicalism, without empty promises, and without trying to become a different person overnight. When someone starts asking what they need to resolve now so they don't carry the same weight for the next 10 years, something changes internally. Because this question doesn't accept generic answers. It doesn't want motivation. It wants honesty. And this is where many people realize that the financial problems that seem too big are actually made up of small decisions repeated for too long. And the first shock that comes from this honesty is understanding that you can't fix everything at the same time. Because trying to solve everything at once creates mental overload that leads to giving up. So the true milestone of financial maturity before 30 is learning to choose priorities. Even knowing that other areas will remain imperfect for a while. This is hard because the mind wants total relief. It wants to fix everything to finally rest. But real life doesn't work that way. And accepting this removes an enormous weight from your shoulders because you stop demanding impossible perfection from yourself and start building real progress. To this point, many people discovered that the biggest financial leak isn't in big expenses, but in postponed decisions, like bills that could have been renegotiated, debts that could have been organized, expenses that could have been adjusted little by little, but were pushed forward out of fear, emotional laziness, or simply exhaustion. Solving these pending issues doesn't give an immediate feeling of victory. It doesn't generate excitement, but it creates something far more valuable: mental silence. That silence that appears when you stop thinking about money all the time, when you lay your head on the pillow and don't feel that automatic tightness in your chest. Another essential milestone before 30 is understanding that financial planning is not predicting the future. It's reducing the impact of the unexpected. Because the common mistake is thinking that organizing money is trying to control everything, when in reality, it's accepting that unexpected things will happen, but they don't need to become tragedies. When you start thinking this way, money stops being an attempt to guess life and becomes a way to absorb shocks. And this completely changes your relationship with fear, because fear stops being paralyzing and becomes just a signal of attention. This is where many people realize they don't need to wait to earn more to start living better financially. They need to start making better decisions with what they already have, because bad decisions on a small scale become disastrous decisions when income increases. This understanding is a turning point because it breaks the fantasy that a raise will solve everything by itself, and at the same time gives control back, showing that you're not condemned to live like this until something external changes. Another very important milestone before 30 is learning to create simple systems that work even on bad days. Because relying on motivation, discipline, or willpower is a trap. No one can be consistent when they're tired, frustrated, or emotionally drained. Systems are automatic agreements with yourself, like paying yourself first, setting clear limits, automating what's possible, and reducing unnecessary decisions. Because the fewer decisions you need to make daily, the less chance you have of making impulsive mistakes. This milestone is powerful because it respects human reality. It starts from the assumption that you won't be perfect. So it builds protection even when you fail. And that brings a much greater sense of security than any promise of eternal discipline. Many people reach 30 without these systems and spend their lives constantly putting out financial fires, solving problems that wouldn't even exist if the basic structure were in place. And when these systems start working, even in a simple way, something interesting happens. You start seeing the future with less fear because the present becomes less heavy. And that's a clear sign that your financial life is maturing. Another essential milestone is stopping making financial decisions to please external expectations, whether from family, friends, or society. Because spending to prove something, maintain an image, or avoid judgment is one of the fastest ways to move away from your own goals. This type of spending is silent. It doesn't seem wrong at the moment. But over time, it drains resources and creates resentment because you start feeling like you're working to sustain a life you didn't consciously choose. Learning to say no financially is a huge maturity milestone because it requires self-knowledge, firmness, and acceptance that not everyone will understand your choices. But the peace it brings makes up for any initial discomfort. And perhaps one of the most transformative milestones before 30 is stopping treating money as the villain of your own story. Because when you see money as an enemy, you run from it, ignore it, procrastinate, and punish yourself, creating exactly the problems you say you want to avoid. When you start seeing money as a messenger, someone who's just showing you what needs attention, everything changes because you stop fighting and start listening. This change in posture doesn't happen overnight, but when it does, your relationship with money becomes lighter, more practical, and less loaded with guilt. Little by little, you realize that the financial milestones before 30 aren't about arriving at a specific place. They're about leaving a constant state of tension, confusion, and fear. And when that happens, even if your life is still far from ideal, you feel something new, a sense of direction, a feeling that there is now a path, even if it's long. And that alone changes everything. In the next part, the narrative goes into what happens after these milestones start to consolidate. Financial life changes in practice, how decisions become clearer, and why reaching 30 with this foundation is far more powerful than reaching it with assets, status, or appearances. When these milestones begin to consolidate, even if still imperfectly, the first change that happens isn't in your bank balance. It's in how you react to problems. Because before, any unexpected event felt like a sign of failure, a reason for panic, or proof that nothing was working. And now it becomes just a problem to be solved. This changes everything, because financial suffering rarely comes only from lack of money. It comes from the feeling of powerlessness, of not knowing what to do, of constantly putting out fires without understanding why the fire never ends. When you start to gain clarity, even without abundance, you recover something that seemed lost. The ability to think before acting, to breathe before deciding, to choose the next step instead of reacting in desperation. And this is an invisible but extremely powerful milestone before 30, because it changes how you deal not only with money, but with your entire life. Another silent change that happens is that the future stops being a shapeless mass of fear and starts to have contours, even if still blurry. Because when everything is financially confused, thinking about the future hurts. It creates anxiety, a desire to run away, and many people avoid even imagining what's ahead just to avoid feeling bad. With these milestones, the future doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be possible. And that alone is a huge relief, because you start making simple, realistic plans without fantasy, but also without desperation. And here, something curious happens that almost no one notices at first. You start making choices that are more aligned with who you are. Because when money stops being a constant threat, you no longer need to use it to compensate for frustrations, prove worth, or relieve momentary pain. This reflects in work, relationships, and daily decisions. Because you stop accepting everything out of fear and start refusing what doesn't make sense. Even if that means moving forward more slowly. This is a huge emotional milestone before 30. Learning that moving slowly, but with awareness, is far better than running without direction and burning out along the way. Many people think financial maturity means losing the spark of life. But in practice, it's the opposite. It's stopping wasting energy trying to appear like something and starting to live something that truly makes sense to you. Another thing that changes a lot is the relationship with financial mistakes. Because they don't disappear. You'll still make mistakes, spend poorly sometimes, make questionable decisions, but the difference is that these mistakes stop turning into existential crises. You learn to correct faster, understand why the mistake happened, adjust the system, and move on. Without that load of guilt that paralyzes and makes you give up on everything, this learning is a fundamental milestone before 30 because it builds financial resilience. Something no high income guarantees. But that makes all the difference throughout life. And the more you develop this resilience, the more you realize that money doesn't need to be the center of your life to be organized. It just needs to be in the right place, fulfilling its role of facilitating, not dominating. Another milestone that starts to emerge at this stage is the ability to make choices thinking about the medium term, something that seemed impossible when everything was urgent. Because before, you lived putting out fires, solving the now, and anything beyond that felt like a luxury. With a minimal foundation, you start thinking about decisions that may not bring immediate relief, but build something better 1, 2, 3 years from now. And that completely changes the game, because you leave survival mode and enter a building mode. This type of thinking is what truly separates those who reach 30 exhausted from those who arrive more at ease, even if both still have challenges. And here it's important to say something that few people have the courage to admit. There is no perfect financial life at 30. There is a more honest, more conscious, and less chaotic financial life. And that alone is a huge victory. Those who reach 30 with these milestones resolved are not free from problems, but they are free from the constant feeling of being lost. And that is priceless. Another milestone that consolidates at this stage is understanding that money is a tool for alignment, not comparison, because you start using money to build the life that makes sense to you, not to compete in an invisible race with people who live completely different realities. This brings a quiet peace, because you stop feeling like you're always behind, always owing something to the world, always running against the clock that never stops. And this peace doesn't come from having a lot. It comes from knowing what you're doing and why. When that happens, financial anxiety starts to decrease consistently. It doesn't disappear all at once, but it stops being constant. And you realize you can think about money without feeling that automatic tightness in your chest. This is one of the clearest signs of financial maturity before 30. Being able to talk about, think about, and decide about money without going into alert mode. And then you understand something very important. These milestones are not meant to impress anyone. They are meant to give you back mental energy, clarity, and a sense of control. With that, life starts to have more space because money stops occupying everything. When you start to see that reaching 30 with this foundation completely changes the next decade, something reorganizes inside. Because until then, the future seemed like a threat, a weight, a place where problems would only get bigger. And now it starts to look like possible territory. Still challenging, but navigable. And that's because 30 is not an endpoint. It's a transition point where those who didn't build a foundation feel like they're forever behind. And those who did, even without major external achievements, feel like they finally have solid ground under their feet. The big mistake is thinking the next decade will require more effort, more sacrifice, and more suffering, when in reality, it requires less chaos, less improvisation, and fewer desperate decisions. Those who reach 30 without these milestones keep living in reaction mode, jumping from problem to problem, and each year feels heavier because energy decreases. Responsibilities increase, and patience with one's own mess runs out. Those who arrive with clarity, even earning little, even without major assets, begin to experience something rare, cumulative progress. The kind of progress that is invisible from one month to the next, but over the years changes everything. This is a silent but decisive milestone because you stop emotionally starting from zero every year, every crisis, every unexpected event. And this even changes how you relate to big choices, like changing careers, studying something new, moving cities, committing to a more serious relationship, or even saying no to paths that no longer make sense. Without a minimum financial foundation, these decisions become dangerous bets made on impulse or fear. But with a foundation, they become strategic moves. Still risky, but calculated. And this is where many people realize they didn't need to have done everything right in there. Vincesi, they just needed not to have given up on organizing their financial life. This realization brings deep relief because it removes the weight of guilt from the past and places responsibility in the present, where you still have control. Another point that becomes clear at this stage is that money doesn't bring peace by itself, but lack of organization steals any chance of peace. And understanding this completely changes the focus because you stop chasing magic numbers and start seeking consistency. Consistency in closing the month, consistency in maintaining a reserve, consistency in respecting limits, consistency in improving a little at a time. This doesn't create an epic victory feeling, but it creates something far more valuable, emotional stability. And that's what sustains any long-term growth. At 30, you start to understand that you don't need to prove anything to anyone financially. You just need to build a life that doesn't drain you every day. And when that understanding arrives, decisions become simpler because you stop asking, what will people think? And start asking, does this make my life better or worse? This is a huge maturity milestone because it ends a phase of self-deception and begins a phase of calm responsibility without drama, without heroics. Another important aspect is that with these milestones resolved, money stops being the center of internal conversations. It becomes background, something that's there functioning while you focus on other areas of life that were previously abandoned due to sheer mental exhaustion. Relationships improve, professional decisions become clearer, mental health benefits, because you're no longer carrying an invisible problem all the time. And perhaps most important of all is realizing that reaching 30 with these milestones doesn't guarantee success, but it protects you from unnecessary wear and tear, and that makes all the difference over time. You make fewer mistakes, suffer less, and learn faster, because you're not always at the limit. And then a new feeling emerges. Hard to explain, but very real. The feeling that life has finally started moving forward, even without glamour. This is the point where many people realize they no longer need to avoid the topic of money, no longer need to postpone decisions, no longer need to punish themselves for past mistakes. There is a path, and it is possible in the next part, the narrative will move into the full emotional closure, connecting all of this with identity, self-worth, and the feeling of finally building something solid, without rush and without comparison. There comes a moment, usually around or just after 30, when the relationship with money stops being just practical and starts touching something much deeper, which is identity. Because for many years, you got used to defining yourself by what you didn't have, what you couldn't do, what you weren't yet. And that silently shapes an internal image of someone who is always owing, always chasing, always lacking. When these milestones begin to solidify, even without big numbers, that image starts to crack. Because for the first time, you realize you're no longer completely lost. And that changes how you see yourself, how you position yourself, and even how you talk about yourself. Before, any conversation about the future created discomfort. You dodged it, joked, changed the subject, because deep down you felt ashamed of not having answers. And now, even without everything resolved, you can talk more calmly because there is a plan. Still simple, still under construction, but real. This is a massive emotional milestone because it restores internal dignity. That feeling that you're not a walking failure just trying to survive, but someone in process building something with the resources they have. And this even changes how you see work. Because before, work was just a way to pay bills and relieve immediate fear. And now it starts to be seen as part of a bigger path, even if it's not your dream job yet. You start asking different questions. Like, where can this take me? What can I learn here? How does this connect with what I want to build? And these questions only appear when money stops being a constant emergency. Another very delicate point that begins to resolve at this stage is guilt. That silent guilt for not having done everything right before, for having spent poorly, for having ignored signs, for having postponed important decisions. Because while financial life is disorganized, that guilt feels justified, almost necessary. But when you start organizing, guilt loses strength because you realize that punishing yourself builds nothing. It just consumes energy that could be used to move forward. This is an internal milestone many people never reach. They spend their entire lives trying to compensate for the past instead of building the future. And that is exhausting. Little by little, you understand that financial maturity is not rigidity. It's responsibility without it's being able to look at your own mistakes, learn from them, and not turn that into a permanent sentence about who you are. And when that happens, anxiety decreases even more. Because you stop demanding immediate results from yourself and start trusting the process more. Even knowing it has ups and downs. Another aspect that starts to change very clearly is the relationship with long-term choices. Because now you understand that every financial decision carries an emotional cost, not just a monetary one. You start realizing that some cheap choices are very expensive mentally, while others that seem harder at first bring more peace over time. This awareness is a huge milestone before 30, because it prevents you from building a financially possible life that is emotionally unbearable. And here, something interesting happens. You start respecting your own limits more, because you understand that earning a bit more isn't worth it if it destroys your health, your time, or your sanity. And this balance doesn't come from theory. It comes from having suffered enough to not want to repeat it. When money starts to occupy the right place, you stop romanticizing financial suffering as if it were a mandatory part of adult life, and you start looking for smarter, more humane, and more sustainable solutions. This is a watershed moment because you realize you don't need to live at the edge to prove worth. You don't need to sacrifice beyond what's necessary to deserve rest, and you don't need to compare yourself to feel valid. Another milestone that consolidates at this stage is quiet confidence. Not flashy confidence, but internal confidence. Knowing that even if something goes wrong, you have the structure to deal with it, adjust, and move forward. This confidence changes everything because it reduces the fear of trying, the fear of failing, and the fear of leaving where you are. And that opens space for real growth in the years ahead. And perhaps the biggest change of all is realizing that money has stopped being the central theme of your emotional life. It no longer defines your daily mood, your self-esteem, or your sense of worth. It becomes just one part of life. Important, but not dominant. And that brings a lightness that many people go decades without feeling. These are the milestones no one posts. No one publicly celebrates, but they completely transform the experience of reaching 30 If you look carefully at everything said so far, you realize that the financial milestones before 30 were never about specific numbers, magic amounts, or visible achievements. They were always about moving from a constant state of tension to a minimum state of control, from eternal improvisation to some predictability, from fear to awareness. At first, it seemed like the problem was not having enough money, but along the way it became clear that the biggest weight came from not knowing where you were going, and why everything felt so exhausting all the time. And that's why so many people reach 30 exhausted, not physically, but mentally, because they spent years living in survival mode, putting out fires, reacting to bills, postponing decisions, and carrying a silent guilt for not being where they thought they should be. The turning point was never earning more, investing better, or getting everything right at once. The turning point was stopping running from your own financial life and starting to organize the basics, even imperfectly, even slowly. When that happens, something very important changes. You stop treating 30 as a sentence and start seeing this phase as a more conscious reset, because now you understand your limits, your patterns, your mistakes, and most importantly, your real possibilities. Financial life stops being a constant weight on your back and becomes an organized enough background for you to live, work, relate, and make choices without that permanent tightness in your chest. And perhaps the greatest liberation is realizing that you don't need to be rich at 30. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need to have always gotten it right. You just need to not be lost anymore. You need to know how much your life costs. You need to be able to close the month without digging holes. You need to have some margin for unexpected events. You need to have minimal clarity about the path you're building. And above all, you need to stop punishing yourself for the past and start taking care of the future with more responsibility and less guilt. These are the milestones that truly matter, because they don't show to others, but they completely transform how you live on the inside. When you reach 30 with this resolved, the next decade isn't as scary, because you're no longer emotionally starting from zero with every problem. You're adjusting, refining, and moving forward. And if you're not there yet, that doesn't condemn you. It just shows you exactly where you need to focus now. Without drama, without rushing, and without comparison. Money, in the end, is neither the villain nor the hero of the story. It's just a reflection of the decisions you make when you're tired, afraid, or aware. And the more aware you become, the less it controls you. If this video helped you organize thoughts that were confusing, ease some of the guilt, or see your financial life with more clarity, that's already a huge step. Now, if you made it this far, I ask you 3 simple things. Leave a like, because that really helps this kind of content keep reaching people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel, because here we talk about money in a way almost no one does. Without glamour, without empty promises, and focused on real life. And comment 1 word so I know you watched until the end. Comment the word focus.